Good evening. Today I'll be sharing nonpartisan information about voting rights, voter suppression, and election security. These are all central to the League's mission to empower voters and defend democracy. The 2020 federal election saw the United States' highest voter turnout of the 21st century. Prior to the election, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the adoption of changes that made voting safer and more convenient. Some states adopted or expanded mail-in voting and liberalized absentee voting rules, and others introduced or expanded the use of drop boxes. Early voting periods were extended to reduce crowds, and in total, 17 million more people voted in 2020 than in 2016. That represents 67% of eligible voters, which is up 5 percentage points. Many voters use these alternative voting methods, and in particular, there was a large shift to early voting and voting by mail. While voter turnout was high, voter suppression also rose. Both Democrats and Republicans have engaged in voter suppression throughout the history of American democracy. Voter suppression today is overwhelmingly achieved through regulatory, legislative, and administrative means. And as you can see, voter suppression takes many forms: harsh voter registration laws, ID laws, making voting less convenient, signature requirements, gerrymandering, voter purges, polling place reductions and relocations, insecure election infrastructure, intimidation of both voters and election officials, the Electoral College, closed primaries, and election disinformation. It's quite an exhaustive list. It's helpful to not only understand these tactics, but to be aware of the backdrop against which they're occurring. Two Supreme Court cases set the stage for greater voter suppression. The first was Shelby County v. Holder. Citizens of Shelby County, Alabama, sued then Attorney General Eric Holder in 2013, citing that sections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act were no longer necessary because voting discrimination was no longer a problem. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. This decision gutted the Voting Rights Act and made it possible for states to enact new restrictive voting laws. This is a map depicting the states shown in blue that have more restrictive laws. In 2021, at least 19 states enacted 34 laws, making it harder to vote. But at the same time, 25 states enacted 62 laws, making it easier to vote. Note, however, that the states that enacted more restrictive laws tended to be ones in which voting was already relatively difficult, and the states that enacted more expansive laws tended to be ones in which voting was already relatively accessible. A new report from the Brennan Center for Justice finds that as of mid-January, legislators in 27 states are considering more than 250 bills with restricted provisions, compared to 75 such bills a year ago. That's a tripling of proposals to restrict the vote. However, again, at the same time, 32 states are looking to expand the access to voting. In other words, access to the right to vote increasingly depends on the state in which a voter lives. As you can see in the map, Illinois has relatively expansive voting laws. Let's take a closer look at restrictive voting laws. First, harsh voter registration laws. In most democracies, national governments bear responsibility for registering their citizens to vote. But in the US, voter registration is decentralized and the responsibility of individual voters. This makes it difficult for voters, particularly new voters and voters with fewer resources, to know how to register. In many states, a physical address is required to register, but Indigenous people tend to get their mail from PO boxes. Some states limit voter registration to in-person transactions, even though increasingly Americans are interacting with government agencies online. Most troubling, Texas, Florida, and Kansas passed vague and cumbersome regulations that threaten nonpartisan civic engagement groups, such as the League, with felony charges or hefty fines for helping voters register if they make a mistake. And these regulations may be enforced unpredictably. Second, although polls show broad cross-partisan support for voter ID laws, it's important to understand that some states accept only narrow forms of photographic identification. For example, in Texas and Tennessee, gun permits are considered valid voter IDs, but student IDs are not. The shorter the list of acceptable IDs, the more concerned we should be. Also, some voters cannot afford or cannot obtain the underlying documents necessary to get a government-issued photo ID. These voters are disproportionately low income, students, racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Third, making voting less convenient also prevents people from voting. Recently, officials across the nation have placed limits on absentee or mail-in voting, curtailed early voting, reduced voting hours, and ended same-day registration. Last, several states are denying people the right to vote because the signature on their voter registration rolls doesn't exactly match the signature on their application or absentee ballot. The second Supreme Court case that increased voter suppression occurred in 2019. That year, the Supreme Court dismissed the Common Cause and League of Women Voters versus Rucho gerrymandering case for lack of jurisdiction. The ruling greenlighted more intense and durable gerrymandering and closed the door to a Supreme Court remedy. Efforts to fight gerrymandering at the state level, including the League's 50-state People-Powered Fair Maps campaign, largely failed. RepresentUs publishes this gerrymandering threat index, pictured here. According to their analysis, more than half of all states, both red and blue states, have laws that put them at extreme risk of gerrymandering. Their analysis concludes that 188 million people will live with the threat of rigged maps for the next 10 years. Maps in Ohio, Wisconsin, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Maryland, New York, North Carolina, and here in Illinois are more aggressive than those a decade ago. The good news here is that the courts are pushing back against the most egregious gerrymandering. Court decisions in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Ohio will force map makers back to the drawing table and result in more competitive seats. The Supreme Court will hear arguments on the constitutionality of Alabama's map to determine if it violates the Voting Rights Act by limiting the political voice of Black voters. Under the pretext of reviewing voter rolls to remove duplicate names or the names of the deceased, officials purge voter lists, deleting millions of eligible voters. These purges often have a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And then voters discover they're no longer listed only when they arrive at the polling place. So at that point, these voters either don't vote or are forced to cast provisional ballots. Polling place reductions result in long lines, pictured here, and last-minute relocations can send pollers to the wrong polling place. Both election intimidation and infrastructure are contributing to voter suppression. Recently, voter intimidation has become more coordinated and more public. And intimidation is not only directed toward voters. Reuters has identified more than 100 threats of violence or death to election officials. Here's a real example. I hope you all go to jail for treason. I hope your children get molested. You're all going to expletive die. The response so far, only 4 known arrests and no convictions. These sorts of threats add to the urgency secretaries of states feel to update election infrastructure. Authorities nationwide are tabulating results on insecure, decades-old voting machines that have reached the end of their shelf life. Also, in key states, paperless voting machines pose accountability risk. Lack of funding for election administration has been a persistent problem, whether in red or blue states. The Election Infrastructure Initiative advocates for investment in election infrastructure of up to $20 billion over 10 years. The Electoral College is the constitutional mechanism by which the election of the President and Vice President of the United States occurs. We don't actually elect our leaders. The Electoral College, which is a small group of appointed representatives from each state, are actually the people who elect our national leaders. The League of Women Voters has had a position to abolish the Electoral College in favor of a one-person, one-vote system for more than 50 years. Under the Electoral College system, electoral outcomes can diverge dramatically from the popular vote. Because most states award their votes on a winner-take-all basis, it is technically possible for a candidate to win the presidency with only 23% of the popular vote. More important, winner-take-all laws tend to decrease voter turnout in states without close races. The Glen Ellyn League's February community meeting discussed electoral college reform, and a video recording can be found on the website LWVGE.org. I highly recommend you listen. It's very, very informative. A growing number of voters consider themselves independents, more than 40% currently. There are compelling reasons for all states to move to open primaries. First, closed primaries disenfranchise independent voters. In a closed primary, only voters registered with a given party can vote in that party's primary. Open primaries give independent voters a primary voice. Second, primaries are publicly funded. It's arguable that publicly funded elections should be open to all voters through open primaries. Third, primary turnout in this country is shockingly low. As a result, closed primaries tend to produce more ideologically extreme candidates. Major party primary campaigns and candidates are designed to appeal to their party's extremes because extreme voters are those most motivated to vote in primaries. And that process tends to produce candidates who are either beholden to special interests who fund their campaigns or actually support their party's most extreme views. Open primaries would ensure that candidates appeal to a broad range of voters, reducing polarization and increasing the accountability essential to democracy. Last, given more extreme and durable gerrymandering, it is often the primary election that determines the outcome of races. Alaska, which is home to a large independent voting bloc, recently established a nonpartisan top 4 open primary with ranked choice voting in the general election. Currently, 15 states have closed or partially closed primaries. Illinois has a partially open primary. Election disinformation is a very effective form of voter suppression. Bad actors, including foreign powers, have circulated lies to trick certain groups out of voting. And then social media allows this disinformation to instantly reach huge numbers of people. The 2020 election cycle saw an explosion of election disinformation. Common examples include the wrong election date, such as this graphic that tells you to vote on Wednesday when the election was on Tuesday. Inaccurate election rules, such as telling people they could text their vote. Scam advertisements that link search terms such as "where's my polling place" or "how to register to vote" with bogus websites that charge fees for registration. Voter intimidation that claims voting will put you in danger if you go to the polls. False claims about election integrity, such as the process is rigged, so don't bother to vote. The picture in the bottom right came from an absolutely unrelated 2-year-old news story, which was used to claim ballots were being dumped in Texas, Pennsylvania, and California. Last, untrue claims about post-election results. In addition to voter suppression, disinformation increases hate and polarization, lowers trust in government, mainstreams fringe science and conspiracy theories, and incites violence. Because there are continued assertions that the 2020 election was stolen through fraudulent means, nearly 1/3 of our country believes President Biden's election was not legitimate. This, despite Attorney General William Barr and state officials in all 50 states finding no evidence of widespread voter loss. All 63 lawsuits attempting to overturn the election were either withdrawn or dismissed. However, voter fraud is being used as a justification to reverse practices that make it easier to vote. So far, no one has been able to document significant examples of election fraud. The Conservative Heritage Foundation maintains an election fraud database. The database documented 17 cases of proven election fraud in 2020, a mathematically insignificant total. Sean Morales Doyle of the Voting Rights and Election Program at the Brennan Center commented, "The type of fraud I think the database is concerned with is not some problem that is out of control, that is not currently tracked, caught, and processed when it happens. States don't need to pass laws because every state already has laws on the books and they work." He advocates for a federal standard to remove some of these patchwork state-by-state rules to increase confidence in elections. Data suggests the often claimed trade-off between election integrity and reasonable measures to make it easier for people to vote is in fact largely false. A new report by the Nonpartisan Voting Rights Lab identifies election subversion threats in states key to the 2024 presidential election. Iowa helped start a national trend of laws targeting election officials with criminal penalties for expanding voting access. It passed a bill that imposes restrictions on election officials, including criminal prosecution, if they do not implement the state's new aggressive voter roll purge. Legislators in Missouri and Oklahoma introduced a bill that would allow them to directly overturn election results. Now, thankfully, that bill did not pass. However, in Arizona, Georgia, and Texas, legislators placed election administration under greater partisan control. States United Democracy Center reports that so far, 21 partisan election designers are running for Secretary of State in 18 states. Their candidacies are absolutely alarming watchdog groups, since secretaries of states are the one who administer and safeguard the democratic process. Across key battleground states, contributions to Secretary of State races are already 3 times higher than at this point in the 2018 elections, particularly in Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan. The recent Brennan Center report I referred to earlier also found that at least 41 bills have been introduced that would undermine the electoral process by giving partisan actors more influence and permitting citizens the right to initiate or conduct post-election audits. These scenarios highlight troublesome aspects and vulnerabilities of the US election administration, namely the degree of decentralization and partisanship. The League of Women Voters supported both the Federal Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to defend democracy. The Freedom to Vote Act is a scaled down version of the very popular For the People Act, which did not pass the Senate. It was designed to garner at least 10 Republican votes. It includes reforms such as modernizing voter registration, expanding opportunities to vote, fighting voter suppression, preventing election sabotage, banning partisan gerrymandering, reforming campaign finance, and promoting election security. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act had two components: a preclearance for voting law changes from jurisdictions with a history of discrimination, and litigation to allow voters to sue jurisdictions to fight discrimination. Historically, voting rights have rarely garnered bipartisan support in America. Most of the time, voting rights were expanded by one party over the objections of the other. Both these acts were sponsored solely by Democrats with no Republican input. Republicans, as expected, blocked passage of both acts, and Democrats' efforts to change the filibuster failed as two Democrat moderates sided with Republicans in blocking any filibuster rule changes. A bit more on the filibuster. A filibuster works to delay or block a vote by one or more members of Congress on a piece of legislation or a confirmation. The filibuster was designed to give a voice to the minority and force the majority to negotiate by requiring at least 60 votes in order for a bill to move forward. However, in recent years, both parties use it as a form of obstruction rather than a negotiating tool. This data from the Senate website shows that the number of filibusters by minority party has steadily increased. The filibuster debate is about admitting defeat to our hyperpartisan government. In 2021, the Senate filibustered 4 bills that would have improved our democratic system. In response, the United States League of Women Voters Board unanimously voted to support filibuster reform and or even elimination. Changes to the filibuster, however, need to be cautiously designed. In 2013, Democrats eliminated the filibuster for cabinet appointments and judicial nominations. So now hundreds of federal judges are now confirmed by a simple majority. And the result is that we have increased judicial partisanship. Legal scholars at Harvard and Stanford explain, and I quote, "The courts take on an expanded policymaking role during periods of intense partisan gridlock. Recent years have seen US courts determine state and national policy on some of the most politically charged controversies of our day. As citizens, we need to pay close attention to judicial appointments and elections." In June 2021, more than 100 scholars of democracy issued a statement of concern, a dire warning that democracy in the United States is in peril. The statement talked about radical changes to core electoral procedures as transformative to states into political systems that no longer meet minimum conditions for free and fair elections. The statement concludes, "We urge members of Congress to do whatever is necessary, including suspending the filibuster, in order to pass national voting and election administration standards that both guarantee the vote to all Americans equally and to prevent state legislatures from manipulating the rules in order to manufacture the result they want. Our democracy is fundamentally at stake. History will judge what we do at this moment." Oops, sorry. The League of Women Voters is part of a growing and increasingly powerful pro-democracy movement. There are 2 major nonpartisan coalitions working on democracy reform. The League belongs to the larger of the 2, the Declaration for American Democracy. The Declaration is comprised of more than 230 member organizations. The National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers was founded by organizations that work to unite Americans across the political spectrum to fight corruption and increase electoral competition. Some organizations like RepresentUs belong to both groups. All of the information in this presentation is sourced from these organizations that are working so hard to defend democracy. Defending Democracy Together is its own group because they are not nonpartisan. They are a group of Republicans, former Republicans, and conservatives committed to protecting every American's right to vote and the rule of law. All of them are regrouping after the defeat of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Mahatma Gandhi, who wrested control of his nation from the most powerful empire in the world, commented, "Without a paper, a journal of some kind, you cannot unite a community." The Fulcrum is a project of Bridge Alliance. It is a free online news platform focused exclusively on American democracy reform efforts. It reports news from across the country on money and politics, redistricting, voting rights, election access, government ethics, civic engagement, and the imbalance of powers. There is a lot going on in the pro-democracy movement that you do not hear about. You'll never hear about it on broadcast television. Its column, The Civic Voice, spotlights civic solutions and success stories as an antidote to round-the-clock bad news. Publishing a story about what's working shows people, hey, it doesn't need to be this way, and energizes citizen-led reforms. We highly recommend signing up at fulcrum.us to give you hope that our democracy can be saved. After both the Voting Rights Act were defeated in the Senate, the League of Women Voters U.S. CEO, Virginia K. Solomon, pictured here, commented, "Despite today's vote, this fight is not yet over. We will not back down and we will not quit until every voter can safely participate in free and fair elections." Reformers continue to focus on key issues such as candidate access and choice, partisan gerrymandering, partisan influence over the administration of election, the unmitigated flow of money in the process, and states passing laws that place unnecessary barriers to the ballot box. The Senate and Biden administration are considering alternative legislation and executive actions. In Texas and Georgia, organizers are conducting robust voter registration and door-to-door canvassing efforts to increase turnout despite new anti-voter laws. Other advocates for democracy are volunteering or running to fill vital roles as election officials. Importantly, a handful of Republican and Democratic senators are reaching across the aisle to discuss a few legislative ideas that could garner bipartisan support. For example, members of both parties support updating the Electoral Count Act of 1887. This act governs the entire electoral presidential counting process, especially for contested elections. Such a law would not only strengthen the process, but bolster confidence in election integrity. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. It has two separate and distinct roles. The first is voter services and education, which provides nonpartisan information about elections and the voting process, and provides citizen education to increase understanding of major public policy issues. That arm operates under a 501c3 nonprofit education status. The second role is advocacy. After exhaustive study, the League develops national, state, and local positions to advocate for or against particular policies in the public interest. Advocacy is conducted under a 501c4 nonprofit civic status. All 50 state leagues remain committed to fighting voter suppression tactics that threaten our democracy through our dual commitment to education and advocacy. The League works to educate voters impacted by restrictive voting laws, inform voters of registration purges, help voters comply with new voter ID requirements, volunteer as nonpartisan poll observers, staff voter protection hotlines, spearhead get out the vote efforts, and issue time for action alerts. We strongly recommend you continue to contact your legislators to push for democracy reform and voting rights. insist that democracy reform is a top priority, especially given the Ukrainian war currently in the news. We cannot lead a global defense of self-rule when our own is being threatened. Suffragists fought tirelessly for decades to win the franchise for women, and were not deterred by failure or setbacks. DuPage County is home to 7 local leagues that work both individually and in concert. We hold voter registration drives to increase turnout. We conduct outreach to youth and low propensity voters, encouraging them to vote. Our websites offer accurate voting information to counter disinformation. We hold candidate forums and publish online voting guides to help voters choose candidates that reflect their values. We host civic awareness events to build civic engagement. And last, we engage in advocacy based on nonpartisan collaborative studies on greater good policy issues. The Glen Ellyn League website provides exhaustive voter registration information, such as who is eligible to vote, how eligible citizens can register to vote, what ID is required to register, and how to check your registration status. Its voting tab, highlighted with this red arrow, also provides information on upcoming elections. Voters can learn what's on their ballot, mark key dates on their calendar for upcoming elections, consider options for how to vote. You can vote early, by mail, in person, or on election day. You can find your polling place, research your ballot. We have links to the Illinois voter guide and also post recordings of our local candidate forums. The Glen Ellyn League's Lollapalooza voter registration drive focused on registering youth. The 18 to 19-year-old age group deserves special attention because they are America's newest voters. Their electoral participation, or lack thereof, indicates how well we are preparing youth to participate in democracy, because voting is a habit-forming behavior. Both millennials and Generation Z are voting generations, and importantly, they tend to be issues voters. A picture is worth 1,000 words. These 2 girls are proud to be voters in our democratic republic. I'd also like to highlight several recent civic education and advocacy efforts. The League hosted a discussion with Glen Ellyn Police and a social justice advocate on community policing in Glen Ellyn. It also partnered with the Glen Ellyn Newcomer and Neighbors Club to educate Glen Ellyn residents on the importance of voting in local elections and the purpose and operations of the Civic Betterment Party. On the advocacy front, the 6 DuPage League joined forces to successfully advocate to replace DuPage County's outdated electronic voting machines with a secure paper ballot system that is ranked choice voting compatible. Given the heightened attention to election security, I'd like to discuss election integrity in DuPage County. Security experts have called for major elections to have a physical paper trail so a trustworthy audit can be performed. In October 2021, the DuPage County Board unanimously approved funding for a new voting system in time for the 2022 June primary. The Hart Intercivic Verity System is built to the most secure standards set by the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. Triple redundancy security features include 100% paper ballots providing a printed vote record, digital capture of all scanned ballots allowing for reliable audits of voter intent. It has no remote access. It is never connected to the internet, making it impossible to hack. A key and a password are required from an election judge to operate printing and scanning. It has very tight USB protection. Seals and locks protect the USBs, and then the entire cases holding the scanners are returned to the election division with a method to check for tampering. Last, given foreign attempts to subvert US elections, Verity is designed, engineered, and manufactured in the US. The Glen Ellyn League is working with the DuPage County Clerk's Election Division to demonstrate the new voting equipment so voters will be both aware of and comfortable using the new equipment when they vote. These demonstrations will be held at the Glen Public Library on Tuesday, May 31st, Wednesday, June 1st, Thursday, June 2nd, and Saturday, June 4th, and there are morning, afternoon, and evening sessions. During the evening session on June 2nd, the League will partner with the Glen Newcomers and Neighbors Club to host a community meeting providing voters with information on the 2022 elections. The meeting will cover both the offices on the ballot and also go over the newly drawn districts for federal, state, and county offices. I'd like to end with information on a critical player in the fight to protect voting rights. Due to growing voter suppression threats, the League of Women Voters works very closely with Common Cause and its election protection program. Common Cause leads a disinformation coalition that maintains a disinformation tip line. Every election year, they hire experienced disinformation analysts and train volunteers to monitor and report disinformation. To date, they've cataloged more than 3,000 disinformation posts. Then they request the removal of these disinformation posts from social media and also develop pre-bunk messaging. They train poll monitors to troubleshoot problems and report bad practices for resolution. They recruit a team of legal experts to staff a voting rights hotline. The hotline is this one, 866-OUR-VOTE. They notify legal teams when court's interference is needed. In addition to personally volunteering and donating to the League of Women Voters, I also donate to Common Cause and its election protection work. Anti-voter bills passed in 2021 and any of these new bills passed in 2022 will make it more difficult for some people to participate in voting for our elections. This year, Common Cause will field its largest election protection campaign to protect everyone's right to vote. Thank you so much for attending our League program. Keep in mind that public pushback has helped defeat some of the worst elements of these recent state-level voting restrictions, and that organizing and political action, such as mass peaceful protests, are necessary to protect the rule of law in elections. If you want to take action to save our democracy and you're not already a member, we encourage you to join. We have a number of important volunteer opportunities and welcome your participation in the growing national pro-democracy movement. You can find joining information on the website, LWVGE.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna, for that amazing presentation. That was packed full of information. At this time, I do see some questions are coming in. I'm going to remind everyone, if you do have a question, you can type it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And Karen Daly, our VP of Communications, who's here, will help organize those questions and give them to Don. So I'll leave it now to Karen.
Great. Hi, everybody. And Donna, that was so informative. And I was trying to think of questions, and every time I would think of one, you answered it in your slide. So I really appreciate how thorough and how broad it was too. We covered a lot of different topics. We have a couple questions coming in now on well, a couple of them are actually on the League. So there was a question about what sorts of laws, well, the League and other groups that are actually doing, voter registration and trying for voter reform in these different states. What laws specifically, and what sort of the punishment for the voter registration types of things that are happening in, I think you mentioned Texas and a few other areas. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Are you asking me what the League is doing about specific laws in specific states?
Well, there are some states that are kind of cracking down on organizations like the League who are registering voters. And so the couple questions actually on that in terms of elaborating on what exactly are the laws that are supposedly being broken, and what are some of the punishments that we're seeing there?
Oh, in terms of leagues. So if so it's not against the law to register voters, but they have these vague and cumbersome regulations that if you make a mistake, you will be prosecuted. And so, of course, league members are volunteers. They're nervous who might not make a mistake. You know what I mean? You might make a mistake if you register a voter. So it makes people afraid to register other people to vote. And so, you know, the one thing I like about Common Cause is they have a lot of lawyers that volunteer their time. And so, you know, you'll see, like when we did the gerrymandering lawsuit with the Supreme Court, it was the League of Women Voters and Common Cause. The League of Women Voters and Common Cause often sue, you know, for these kinds of things that seem unconstitutional. And so, you know, they've passed a law, but the court remedies take time. And so we have the election already coming up. So you can't pass laws too close to an election, which is why you're seeing this flurry of laws, you know, in January and then early February, a flurry of laws that they're trying to pass really quickly if you want to, you know, suppress votes. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question, but.
So the main thing that leagues can do is actually take this to court, usually with a partner, and
Yeah.
we're seeing that in most of the states.
Yeah, I think there's only 2 states that have said that civic organizations can't register voters. So League of Women Voters in other states are really trying to get out the vote. And like I said, that I went through all the state things where they're trying to, if there are voter purges, they're trying to let people know there's voter purges. You can go to our website and check your registration status. Be sure you check your registration status before you go to the polls, because you won't know if you've been purged. You know, they're not going to send you a notice that you've been purged. So that's why I think it's really important to be aware that all 50 states have league websites where you can check your registration status. You can register to vote. You can get accurate information, so you're not taking your information from these social media posts. So the league websites are really, really a very wonderful line of defense against a lot of these things. You know, those 2 states that have placed, you know, restrictions on civic organizations, those are targeted at the league, you know, because we're very successful in registering voters. So
one of your slides had a lot of organizations, some of which I had not heard of before, that are there to support democracy.
Right.
Do you feel like there is enough, all these groups are working in concert to, because otherwise I would imagine it could be a little disjointed?
Yeah, for my purposes, especially somebody with an MBA, I feel they are too disjointed, because you're talking about oligarchic authoritarian forces who are working in concert with lots of money. And so I do feel that the pro-democracy movements, the 2 separate coalitions, are too fragmented. I think that the Fulcrum is something that's trying to bring people together. I think they recognize that they've been too fragmented. If I had my druthers and I was going to design everything, I would make one funnel of donations, and that would have a joint strategic plan for all 230 organizations. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, you're good at this, you're good at this, you're good at this, you're good at this. We all have the same strategic plan. We have one funnel of donations so that people aren't trying to donate to 230 separate organizations. And so to me, that would be more effective. So we're not there yet, but I do think there is getting to be a lot more coordination. So I've been doing this 5 years. Certainly there's more coordination now than there was 5 years ago. I will tell you that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are a member of the League of Women Voters as well as RepresentUs.
Yeah.
And I think probably this audience is more familiar with the League than they are with RepresentUs.
Right.
Could you give just a little bit more background information on that organization?
Sure. So RepresentUs is the nation's largest grassroots anti-corruption organization. So they started maybe about 20 years ago, and they were really working on corruption. They developed model legislation called the Anti-Corruption Act, where they wanted to pass certain things that they felt would get rid of the worst sources of corruption. Things like, you know, bribery of officials through campaign financing. They wanted to get rid of lobbying. They wanted to use ranked choice voting. They were big on ranked choice voting early, before anybody knew what it was. So, you know, they had this model legislation to stop political bribery, end secret money, and fix our broken elections. Those were their 3 pillars. And they felt like the only way we were going to save democracy was to unite people across the political spectrum, because Democrats, I think, are roughly maybe 29% of the electorate. Republicans are about 23% electorate. And then these other people, the majority of people are kind of in the middle. And so they might identify as independents, they might lean left or they might lean right, but they tend to be more centrist. And so really, Democrats and progressives alone are not going to save democracy. Republicans are not going to save democracy. It really requires that kind of silent majority to get involved. And so I do think in terms of getting people to join the league, this civic awareness and getting people engaged and understanding that we could lose our democracy, that's a real threat. I don't think people understand it's not being talked about in broadcast news, and readership of newspapers is way down, and they tend to be controlled by large corporations anyway. So, people do not hear about what's going on. This is not being talked about. So that's why I think people should be subscribing to the Fulcrum.
There are many things that you said that kind of made all the hair stand up on the back of my neck. One of which was, the fact that because of the filibuster and reducing the need to have bipartisan support of judges, our judges are becoming much more partisan.
Yes.
A lot of these election lawsuits that the league and other groups are involved in are being punted to some of these judges. In addition, we see that Secretary of States are running who were the 2020 election deniers, and so it just with the laws that are being put into the books, just feels like it's systemically the notion of, or the idea of voter suppression is just becoming so systemic that what it's frustrating to think what can we do? For example, on the fact that these Secretary of States are running it, is there recourse for that?
So, I think, here in Illinois, we have egregious gerrymandering. It's just on the Democratic side. But I'm less concerned about the Secretary of State race here. In Wisconsin, I'm more concerned about the Secretary of State race. In terms of writing a strategic plan for the league, I would argue that the states that have expansive voting laws could sister state with states that have restrictive laws. Excuse me, I need a glass of water. But so for example, I know Wisconsin, RepresentUs Wisconsin wrote me and said, we need some help. And I'm guessing if RepresentUs Wisconsin needs help, the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin probably needs help. So I think they were concerned about their Secretary of State race and things that are happening there. So, I think we could partner certainly with either Wisconsin or Michigan as a sister state. And so, find out what they need and offer some help. I also think that, like I said, this Common Cause with its election protection, to me, they are the most critical player at this particular point, plus the Brennan Center.
One of the bigger tools that the league has in our toolbox are the forums, the candidate forums that we do for primaries and for elections.
Right.
And so how can we use our candidate forums to, I guess, should there be a question there that asks, do you believe the 2020 election was fair and free and fair, or how do we address this in some of our forums?
Yeah, I think here, we certainly could ask that. I know that the State League puts together the questions for any state level candidates. I think the DuPage leagues could get together and ask questions of our county candidates, and then each individual league can ask questions of the local candidates that are both ethics and campaign finance oriented. One thing I do want to mention, I do hope to bring to the entire DuPage League, Reform for Illinois, which I follow, they maintain the Sunshine database. So for our local races here, you always want to check who's funding your candidate. You want to know who is giving money to their campaign, because if they have major donors, you know, we all understand that those major donors are have access. That's what I'm going to say. Yeah. Not that I'm going to suggest there's impropriety going on, but when you give a major donation to a campaign, you definitely have access.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a couple of, we have a question here about one on ranked choice voting, for example. So
Okay.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on ranked choice voting and what you see the possible benefits and possible future of systems that use ranked choice voting?
Right. So ranked choice voting will allow you to, it's not just, you don't only get one vote. You get to rank your candidates. So let's say you have 3 candidates on the ballot. In DuPage County here, we tend to have, maybe 2 or 3 candidates, not so many at the county level, but certainly at the state level, for governor, we might have maybe 5, 6 candidates. And then you can rank them in order. This is my first choice. This is my second choice. This is my third choice. This is my fourth choice. This is my 5th choice. And then what happens, there are rounds. So you have to wait until all the votes are in. You can't start counting until all the votes are in. So one of the things people have to understand about ranked choice voting is you're not going to get quick election results straight away as elections are coming in, because you can't start voting until all the votes are in. Then once all the votes are in, they go through a round and they take the 6th person, the person who is in 6th place and has the least amount of votes. They eliminate that person and they redistribute all of those voters' second choices. So then that person's voters will then have their second choice, and then it gets redistributed to the 5 candidates. Then they go again to a second round, and the lowest vote getter in the second round gets eliminated. So now you have 4 candidates, and it goes on like that until somebody gets 50% plus 1 of the vote. And what it does is it ensures that a person cannot win a race unless they have majority support from the voters. So what this does is it makes people run campaigns so that they are more broadly appealing, because they have to appeal to at least 50% of the vote. And so it tends to decrease this polarization that we're experiencing. And it also tends to make people look at the candidates more closely, as opposed to just like voting party lines. You know what I mean? When you really don't know what those candidates are really about and who's funding them and all things like that, you really got to take a look and see who they are. So the Alaska election, RepresentUs really wants to see top 4 or top 5 open primaries. So for example, like in Chicago, where they had 14 candidates for mayor, all 14 candidates would run, and they would take the top 5. The top 5 vote getters would then proceed to the general election, and you'd use ranked choice voting in the general election. That's what Alaska does. And they think that generates, not only majority support for the winning candidate, but it tends to, like I said, move people from extreme edges a little bit more toward the middle. It also gets to be very, it reduces the incivility of the election process, the campaigning that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. Because if you want to get somebody's second or third choice, if you want to be somebody's second or third choice, you're not going to denigrate that candidate, because those voters are not going to pick you for their second or third choice if you denigrate their first choice. So what it tends to do is create much more civil campaigns that are more issues oriented.
That's great.
I should say we had a rank your beer demonstration to demonstrate what ranked choice voting is like. And I highly recommend every league do something like that so people can see what it's like. Our new election infrastructure is ranked choice voting compatible. Mm-hmm. So I've talked to the county clerk about it. And it is a learning process. So I think county clerks across the country are all starting to look at ranked choice voting and educate themselves on it, so that if a law does get passed, they'll know how to administer.
Great, great. And I saw a couple of people have their hands up. Just as a reminder, if you want to have a question answered, please put it in the Q&A section. Just for security of this recording, etc. We are handling questions and answers that way. So please go ahead and type it into the Q&A. On the issue of voting and boundaries, we had a question: have any states explored proportional representation where voters select a party's slate of representatives for the whole state, thus eliminating the need for district boundaries within the state?
You know, I'm not an expert on that. I think a couple of states, let's see, Nevada has unicameral legislation. I think there's 2 states that do that. I think Nevada might be one. I forget the other one. I'm trying to remember. I'd have to look that up for sure. But most states do not. I think that proportional representation is a wonderful idea. I really like that idea. Again, the political will to get it done. You know, in this environment, I don't see that as being a possibility for the political will. I mean, we're fighting for, you know, voting rights right now. So, you know, changing electoral processes, I don't know. I think that, you know, ranked choice voting is sweeping the nation. So that may result in candidates who might want to change more electoral laws. So, I mean, I really think ranked choice voting out of all of the voting reforms and pro-democracy reforms is the one experiencing the most success right now. Also, open primaries. You know, people never heard of open primaries like 5 years ago when I first started this. And now I think people are very well aware of it and learning more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Recently in DuPage County, and actually it's still going on, we have an election that was contested. And part of the back and forth in that discussion was with regard to election judges, signature of ballots. Right. So I understand that there is a proposal for a law going through now in Illinois to remove those. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the league did issue a time for action saying that, you know, please support this law. You know, we think that it's absolutely unfair that a sort of a clerical error by a person in the polling place should negate somebody's vote. So there is a law, it's being considered. I'd have to look at Bill Track 50 to see where it is in the process right now. I know I did fill out a witness slip, and I'm sure other league people did. If you join the league, you know, you get these time for action alerts so that when legislation is brought up and it's considered, we can fill out witness slips to say, yeah, I support this legislation, please put this through. So it hasn't been passed as of yet. I monitor a wonderful news outlet. It's a nonprofit news source funded by the McCormick Foundation called Capital Illinois. And they are just Johnny on the spot in Springfield, and they will tell you everything that gets passed every single day. So I know it hasn't been passed yet. It might be still in committee. I don't think it's gone to a floor vote yet.
Do we need to take a little break for you to get a drink, or are you okay?
I'm okay.
Okay.
Keep going, yeah. I'm sorry, my voice getting deeper and lower.
We're making you talk a lot, so
That's okay.
we appreciate all this great information.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's one of the questions we had was what are your sources? What is your go-to every day? In terms of staying up on top of these things. You mentioned a few resources there, but what's a typical news scan for you look like? Right.
So yeah, I read everything. I'm kind of an information and political junkie, but the one I recommend, you know, I know people probably don't want to read as many sources as I do, but the one I recommend nationally is this Fulcrum, fulcrum.us. So FULCRU. I could put it in the chat. Can I put it in the chat or? Yeah, fulcrum.us. Let me put that in the chat. Let's see, can I do it to everyone? Yeah, everyone. Okay, let's see. So fulcrum.us, you can just Google that in, excuse me, and sign on. It's absolutely free. And it just focuses on democracy reform efforts around the country. And so you really understand and get this kind of news, both good and bad. It will tell you, for example, like Florida is outlawing ranked choice voting, which tells you it's a really good reform if Florida is outlawing it. so that just came across, let me think, when was that? That was, I think, what's today? Thursday. So I think that came across like Monday or Friday. And I was like, whoa, I mean, that's incredible. Because Represent Us passed its first anti-corruption act in Florida, so way ago. And it was done by a group of progressives and Tea Party activists who came together and passed an anti-corruption act. So you don't see that too often. But anyway, so for ranked choice voting to be outlawed at the state level is, really incredible. So anyway, fulcrum.us nationally. I am going to give to arrange a talk through the Civic Awareness Series that the Wheaton League does in partnership with McCormick Foundation at Cantini on the Fourth Estate here in Illinois. So in Illinois, there's been a huge shift across the country in philanthropic newspapers. So in other words, people don't trust news sources because there's not as much of a division between the editorial side and the advertising side. And so a lot of these newspapers, too, newspaper readership, especially the pandemic, killed newspapers. So what's happening, rather than lose newspapers, is these philanthropic organizations are buying the newspapers and turning them into nonprofit organizations. So the McCormick Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the United States, has newspapers and democracy as its funding priorities. So they fund Capital News, which is a reporter out of Springfield, and they report every legislation thing that's happening. So I really like them. I also there's a nonprofit organization, actually it's out of not out of Elmhurst. It's called Illinois Center, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it now. But anyway, it takes, I'll find it and put in the chat. I can give you some information on my favorite ones. But anyway, I'm going to do one on the Fourth Estate, and I'm going to have this guy, used to be a Tribune reporter, and now he reports for this organization that has Democrats and Republicans look at every single article they write to make sure that it's a balanced and fair article. And I really like what they put out too. So there's a couple of my favorites. And so we're going to do a presentation on the Fourth Estate, probably in May or June. So I would definitely look for that because I will go over all of the sources in Illinois. And then later on, I'd like to do a broadcast one. Broadcast television has been, CNN just got bought by a partisan guy. So.
And that's with the McCormick and the Wheaton League. Is that what?
Yes, it's called Civic Awareness Series. I think you can look at it at the Cantini website, the Civic Awareness Series.
Yep.
So great. Yeah, I'm starting to plan it end of March and getting a speaker for it.
That's terrific. We'll definitely promote that because I think a lot of our members and community will be interested in that. We did have a question related to that. Does the Illinois Press Association vet the news sources? The ones that are philanthropic or the ones that have a strong slant?
I do believe that they contribute to some of these nonprofit sources. I mean, a lot of these reporters were let go, because the newspapers were not doing well, and they, so a lot of heavy hitter reporters got laid off. So, they were floating around, and so the press corps is a huge donor to some of these nonprofit, news sources. So there's a lot happening in, even the Daily Herald. I don't know if any of you get the Daily Herald, but the owners of the Daily Herald sold it to their employees because they didn't think it was profitable enough. And so it's an employee-run newspaper now, which is also kind of interesting.
Right.
So.
And the Sun-Times and WBEZ are
merging.
Also merging.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in the presentation. And then the Venture Capital, Alden Group bought the Tribune. So, so like I said, there's tons of stuff happening in the Fourth Estate here in Illinois, and we all need to really understand, the news cycle and where to get our news, because without the Fourth Estate, you don't have democracy. The Fourth Estate is really the fourth check and balance on power in democracy.
Absolutely. So you briefly mentioned the war in Ukraine. And the one thing that strikes me from this too, first of all, we see bipartisan support in the US
Yes.
for the Ukrainians.
Right.
And there's a lot of discussion on both sides about just the protection of democracy, that a democratic country was invaded, taking away their sort of the right to choose who they wanted to be managed by.
Right.
I don't know what if you have thoughts about that, given it's so hot in the news right now and so concerning in so many ways.
Right. So it's interesting because you have one political party. I have to be careful here. Let me think a minute. Let's see. I will say that there are, it's come to the point where some voters and also certain political parties, it's like party over country. I think that's a good way to put it. Party over country. And one of the RepresentUs most successful campaigns was in North Dakota, where they had these two, and I'm going to swear, but it's not me swearing. It's what they said. These two grandmas were dubbed the badass grandmas of North Dakota because they were two old ladies. One of them was a Republican and one of them was a Democrat. And together they led an anti-corruption coalition, and they passed in the state of North Dakota the most comprehensive anti-corruption law in the United States. And it was amazing because you had this unified coalition, which doesn't often happen. So I kind of think there's an opportunity here because people across the spectrum are all supporting Ukraine for pro-democracy. And if we can get that kind of unity, we can push back against these authoritarian forces in the United States. But people have to be aware of what's happening. And in all the information I presented in my presentation, do you see that on television? And do you see that in the newspapers? You don't, right? And so, that's a problem of why we're not defending ourselves. We're defending Ukraine, which not that I don't think we should defend Ukraine. I think we should defend Ukraine, but I also think we should defend ourselves, from authoritarian forces. So, and again, I do think that citizen awareness and getting people engaged is very important. And that's where the League shines. We do educate people on these issues. We have volunteers like myself. I mean, I hold a full-time job, but I volunteer as an issues and advocacy specialist so that I can help my fellow Americans who maybe don't have as much time as I am because, I'm an empty nester and I don't have any kids at home. And so I can help people who might be more busy filter the information down to the nuts and bolts of, what you need to know. So.
Yeah. Relatedly, we have one final question here, unless some other people pop on with a question.
Yeah.
Things seem to be sliding backwards. How do you cope with this frustration? It seems voters are losing their ground and their voices. So what do you do to face that frustration and try to tackle it head on?
Yeah, I'm an eternal optimist. I kind of feel like, I might be a bird carrying a drop of water in my beak to put out a forest fire, but I read the Fulcrum and I bring my drop of water to the forest fire, hoping to inspire others who might bring their drop of water to a forest fire. And I do think you can ignite people. I'm very energized by young people. When you talk to them about problems, they're very concerned about climate change. They're issues voters. I do think these younger people are, less party oriented. So I have 5 nephews and my daughter who are all kind of in their 20s and just turned 30. And they will not affiliate with a party. They're like, here's what I want to have happen. I want you to fight climate change. I want you to do this. I want you to do that. They're very issues voters. And so if you're not party loyal, I think there's hope in that. It was just kind of like those 2 women that passed the Anti-Corruption Act in North Dakota. One of their slogans was country over party, country over party. And I do think that that's really cool. And if you read about those 2 women who were just, retired women, like my, I'm almost retired, but like myself, who just garnered tremendous, door to door, getting their friends, friends, and just building a tremendous coalition to get this done in North Dakota. They got all kinds of press because they were, they were a Democrat and a Republican coming together, and they were two old women, and it was just, it was a big story. And so they got even more people involved, and they really got a lot of press from it. So I think it's possible. I do think it's possible if we all just put an oar in the water and start rowing as fast as we can, because we're going upstream. So
yep, that's right. We all need to put our oar in the water for sure. Absolutely. We just had another question pop up. Back to the League's role in addressing disinformation during candidate forums, specifically candidates who openly voice disinformation that has been put to rest. How also as a nonpartisan group, how do we tackle that? Would you recommend?
Yeah, so I think you have to call out disinformation anytime you hear it. If we have a moderator and somebody is, engaging in an untruth, I think you have to say, you have to counter that. In a candidate forum, they're going to have an opponent, and likely that opponent will counter the disinformation. And then the League can say, we will have a fact checker on this, and it will be added to the candidate forum recording. I do think I'm very energized by the Vote 411. I think the Vote 411 has potential across the nation to, if we can get all those 230 organizations to join the Vote 411 and really make Vote 411 a national voice for election information. The other thing I think it can do is reduce money in politics, because if we can get people to turn off the TV and throw out all of those brochures and go to the League website for information about candidates, that has been tested, is fair, is balanced. You're not going to have people running on things that, seem egregious. If you have ranked choice voting, you're also going to, get rid of some of these extreme ideologies that are kind of engaging in, fringe things. It's sort of like the tail wagging the dog. You know what I mean? That's kind of how I feel certain things are happening, where extremist tails are wagging the dog. And a lot of it is we have got to increase the primary vote turnout. You have got to increase the primary vote turnout. So that's in my league. That's what I'm going to concentrate on for this election, increase primary vote turnout.
Yeah, and the local elections as well. We've had things come down to one vote, and it's definitely have to do that, and that's something that the League is I think well positioned to help with.
Yeah, and I think too, I did read an article recently that women usually vote in higher percentages than men, and that because of the pandemic, women were very weighted down with school and childcare worries and job worries and financial worries and losing their jobs, that they are, polls are indicating that they may be fatigued and may not turn out to vote in the midterms because the pandemic is just sort of, crushed down on them. And so I do think the League has a role in, making it as easy as possible for women to re-engage in the voting process, even when they, have struggled so long during this really, really lengthy pandemic. So I guess I do want to point that out for something that maybe we can do around here.
Absolutely. It's been a tough couple of years, that's for sure.
It has. Yes, it has.
Absolutely. Well, there are no open questions now. Is there anything that you would like to leave us with before our co-presidents pop back on?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this, because I think it's so important, and I appreciate the number of attendees who took their time to come tonight. Thank you so much.
This has been wonderful, and I leave it to Sarah and Michelle and Jody. Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to thank everyone who joined us tonight for the community meeting on voter rights, voter suppression, and election security. Wow. I really want to give special thanks to Donna for an outstanding and really engaging presentation and an excellent response to our questions. I know I learned a great deal, and I am sure our audience did also. So we really thank you very much, Donna. Please check out our website for educational information on the new voting machines that we were talking about for DuPage County. And go to our website to see some of these other presentations and other information. It is constantly being updated and constantly trying to inform voters, promote democracy, and promote voter engagement. So once again, thanks again for joining us, and have a very pleasant rest of your evening. Good night.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.